Okay, let's unpack this. When we talk about serial killers, we often focus on the period of their activity, the terror, the capture, the sensational trial.
Right.
But today's deep dive is really about the aftershocks. It's about the final reckoning of Rodney Alcala's story.
Hmm.
We are examining the consequences that outlasted the man himself, focusing squarely on that shadow that remained long after his death.
And that shadow is just uniquely long and complex in the case of Alcala. It really is. What makes his story so compellingly tragic and ultimately a case study in how investigations evolve is that the true measure of justice.
Yep.
The closure for so many families, it didn't happen in a courtroom in 1979 or even 1986. It came decades later, slowly, agonizingly, and, well, ironically.
And that irony is the centerpiece of what we're talking about today. I
Yeah.
mean, we are talking about cold cases that were cracked wide open, not by some brand new technology alone, but by the killer's own documented evidence.
Vice trophy.
His trophies, which became a roadmap for justice.
Yeah.
It's just bizarre.
It's completely bizarre. And we have to start with that chilling inventory. When Alcala was arrested back in 1979, police discovered his most macabre possession. It was this archive.
An archive containing over 1,000 photographs.
Over 1,000 of men, women, teenagers, children. For decades, these images just remained locked away in evidence lockers, a terrifying silent gallery of the unknown.
Proof of his obsession.
Exactly, proof of his obsession, yet seemingly useless because they were all anonymous.
So the central irony here is it's profound. Alcala, the predator, he collected these images for his own dark gratification, right?
Yeah.
Maybe to relive the moment, or to simply possess the memory of control.
Of course.
But that very compulsion, that need he had for documentation, turned his private obsession into a public ledger of his crimes. His visual diary became the unexpected, powerful key to unlocking decades of silence.
So our mission today is really to analyze that enduring legacy. We need to focus on, I think, 3 distinct areas. First, how Alcala's own documentation, those photos, led to those breakthroughs in decades-old cold cases. Second, the really complex, conflicted emotions that surrounded his death after all those years on death row.
And
finally, the lasting systemic reforms his heinous crimes inspired across U.S. law enforcement. Because there were changes.
Right, so we're exploring what happens when the final chapter of a killer's life closes. But the questions he left behind, particularly those posed by the hundreds of faces he photographed, continue to multiply. It ensures his impact, and the search for justice is still ongoing.
It's very much ongoing.
So let's start with those ghosts in the box, the photo archive.
The initial challenge facing investigators it was just immense. I mean, try to put yourself in their shoes in 1979 or even the 80s. You have thousands of unlabeled analog photographs.
Physical prints?
Physical prints. Some are decades old, all of varying quality. You can't search them with facial recognition databases because those just didn't exist when the pictures were taken. The traditional investigative trail had gone completely cold.
So this is where these analog crimes sort of crash into the digital age.
Yeah.
That's where we see the shift, right?
That's the turning point.
Yeah.
In 2010, authorities finally recognized the absolute limitations of traditional police work over a 30 to 40-year time frame.
People's memories fade.
Institutional memory fades, witnesses die, paper files, they literally deteriorate. So they decided on what the sources rightly describe as an unprecedented tool for justice.
And what was that?
They executed this huge investigative pivot. They
Right.
published hundreds of those photographs online. It was a massive, calculated public plea.
A Hail Mary, almost.
It was. The message was so direct and, frankly, desperate. It was, do you recognize this person? Help us identify them before it's too late.
I mean, that decision to upload these highly traumatic images, that must have been incredibly difficult. Weren't authorities concerned about the immediate trauma this would inflict?
Oh, absolutely.
You could have hundreds of families who might recognize someone who wasn't necessarily a victim or who might misidentify a photograph. It just seems like a massive gamble on public assistance.
It absolutely was a gamble, but it was a necessary one. It was born of attrition, really. Law enforcement had to leverage the public's vast reach, the instantaneous spread of digital media, in a way traditional police work just couldn't touch.
Because they'd hit a wall.
A complete wall. They understood that while the institutional system had failed to connect the dots across states and decades, familial recognition, that sudden, undeniable jolt of seeing a loved one's face, That might be the only thing that could survive the passage of time.
Let's delve a little deeper into that, into the psychology of Alcala's compulsion to document everything. Dr. Elena Santos, the forensic profiler, she often talks about the role of trophies.
Hmm.
Alcala didn't just take pictures, he collected faces. Why was this visual method of documentation so uniquely vulnerable to the digital strategy they used decades later?
Well, it links directly to his need for control and permanence. It's a great question. Unlike a physical trophy, say, a piece of jewelry that can be lost or, easily disposed of, a photograph freezes the victim at the moment of his power.
It's an immutable record.
It is. For him, it offered a psychological re-entry point into the experience. But the drawback, which he clearly failed to foresee, is that visual information is the single most powerful trigger for human memory.
Especially recognition by family.
Especially. By 2010, the internet offered a platform large enough to guarantee that the right eyes would eventually, hopefully, land on the right image.
So he basically turned a private compulsion into a massive, crowdsourced investigation against himself.
Without a doubt. And in 2016, that tactic paid off. It provided a breakthrough in a case that had haunted investigators for nearly 4 decades. And we're talking about the identification of Ellen Hover.
Ellen Hover, captured in photo, #117.
That's the one. Photo #117 was the specific catalyst that validated the entire strategy. She was a young woman, only 23, an aspiring music promoter from a relatively wealthy family. She vanished from Los Angeles in July 1977.
And despite the family having resources.
Despite significant resources dedicated to the initial search, the trail just went painfully cold.
So for 39 years, that photo is just a face in a box, an anonymous face. And the ultimate key wasn't some forensic technician or a new witness, it was her cousin.
Her cousin, Blair Hover. He recognized that specific photograph published online.
Talk about the significance of that one moment of recognition.
I mean, that recognition was the crucial, non-replicable connection. Police had the photo, and they had a missing person report from 1977. But without a link between the two, they were just static facts. Blair Hover's testimony provided the bridge.
It was the positive, undeniable identification.
Yes, and that allowed investigators to re-examine the case with Alcala as the confirmed prime suspect.
And so what was the outcome of that re-examination once they had that positive ID?
Well, the case was immediately reactivated, and now investigators could use forensic tools that simply didn't exist in 1977. So in 2016, Alcala was formally charged with the murder of Ellen Jane Hover.
And Sheriff Jim Anderson, he made it clear this was a direct result of the public's help.
He did. He said, and this is a quote from our sources, that this success was a direct result of the public's help in identifying a photograph from Alcala's collection.
He called it a testament to the fact that we never stop seeking justice, no matter how much time has passed, which highlights that dedication, but also the reality that the system needed an outside catalyst, the public, to succeed where its own archives had failed.
Absolutely. And critically, this wasn't an isolated incident. It wasn't a one-off. The strategy proved its efficacy again and again, demonstrating that Alcala's collection held dozens, perhaps hundreds, of these keys.
And we see a mirror image of this agonizing journey in another case.
We do, in the case of Pamela Jean Lamson.
Pamela Jean Lamson was 28 when she vanished in 1978, and her sister, Christine Thornton, she endured a similar decades-long search over 30 years of just agonizing uncertainty.
30 years of searching records, following dead-end leads, wrestling with the total absence of information.
So imagine the devastating confluence of emotions when Christine sees her missing sister's face among those published photos.
It's just unimaginable. It was simultaneously the worst possible confirmation that her sister had likely been a victim of this monster, and at the same time, the only possible path to closure.
And that positive identification by Christine Thornton led directly to Alcala being charged.
It did, in 2016, for Lamson's murder as well.
This truly crystallizes the profound and, perverse legacy of Rodney Alcala. His obsessive documentation, which he collected for his own dark sense of power, became the systematic, unexpected roadmap for detectives.
Each identified face was a door opening toward closure for a grieving family, all thanks to the killer's own arrogance.
But it's vital to place this photographic strategy within the broader timeline of the investigation, isn't it? The photo IDs in 2010 and 2016, they were built on groundwork laid a decade earlier.
Yes, primarily through the maturation of DNA technology. We have to separate the two strategies.
So let's define that difference. How did the early 2000s DNA work differ structurally from the photographic identifications that came later.
Okay, so the DNA work focused on connecting Alcala to known victims, or to known crime scenes where biological evidence had been preserved. In the early 2000s, as national forensic databases finally matured, authorities could run preserved samples against Alcala's profile.
This is how they linked him to victims like Jill Parento and Charlotte Lamb.
Exactly. Across different states, even. They had the victim, they had the killer. They just needed that biological link to tie them together in court.
So DNA provided the biological link on cases that were, let's say, resolved in terms of knowing who the victim was, but just lacked a suspect connection.
Right. But the photographic archive, that provided the visual and contextual link on unresolved cases. Cases where the victim might not even be classified as a homicide victim yet. They were just a face in a picture.
They were just a missing person.
Exactly. The photo strategy worked on victims who were still only listed as missing persons, or maybe, horrifyingly, never reported at all. The synergy is terrifying, but it's also deeply effective. You have the molecular evidence connecting him to the known, and the visual evidence connecting him to the unknown.
But the work, as Detective Maria Flores synthesized so well, is far from over.
Not even close.
She noted that while technology is a game changer, the archive remains this massive open question. She inherited those files in 2020, and she described it as inheriting boxes of faces, not just paper evidence.
And she emphasizes the overwhelming scale of the challenge that Alcala left behind. She recognizes the advancement, of course. They can now run samples against national databases that didn't exist in the 70s. But the photo archive forces this constant, haunting question.
For every Ellen Hubbard we identify,
We have to ask, who are the other 100? Who are the other 1,000? The work doesn't end, it evolves.
that concept, that the killer's legacy continues to unfold through the slow, ongoing process of identification, is a truly haunting note. The work continues long after the man who created it has died.
And while all this was happening, he was on death row.
Right, so let's move into that final chapter, the final cell.
While these cold cases were slowly being reopened thanks to the digital archive, Rodney Alcala was spending decades in the isolated environment of California's death row at San Quentin.
And for the victims' families, this was a multi-decade ordeal. The sources call it a torturous passage of time.
It was. He was first sentenced to death in 1980 for the murder of Robin Samso, but California's appeal process is notoriously long and exhaustive.
He endured 2 overturned convictions, multiple retrials.
Before finally facing a successful third conviction in 2010, that's 3 decades of him just occupying this space in the legal system. And this process, which is designed to ensure due process, had the horrifying side effect of just extending the suffering of the victims' families exponentially.
He literally transformed within the system.
He did. The sources describe him accurately as becoming an old man in prison blues. Relying on medical care, physically frail.
It's such a stark visual contrast to the confident, charming, athletic bachelor image he had cultivated and so successfully deployed on national television decades before.
But that physical transformation, it didn't mean any kind of psychological reckoning. The enduring manipulation continued right up until his final days.
How did he continue to try and control his narrative? How did he maintain that facade of innocence while locked in a maximum security prison?
He used every available channel of communication he had. He never, ever stopped maintaining his innocence. He corresponded extensively with journalists, with true crime writers, always trying to spin this narrative of being a talented, misunderstood artist who was targeted by overzealous police.
It was a continuation of the gaslighting he used on his victims.
Absolutely. Now it was just aimed at the public.
And he took it a step further than letters, didn't he? He attempted to publish a manuscript. Our sources mention it was a rambling, self-aggrandizing manuscript titled You, the Jury.
Yes. And what was the core purpose of that, beyond just pure vanity? It was a final, desperate attempt at narrative control and, frankly, psychological warfare.
What is in it?
In the manuscript, he attempted to dispute key evidence, cast suspicion on other people, and paint himself as a victim of judicial error. It's a hallmark of these high-control personalities. Even when they're condemned, they cannot relinquish the belief that they are smarter than the system that caught them.
It was his way of maintaining the mask of innocence when the physical mask, his charm, was long gone.
That's a perfect way to put it.
It's just fascinating how that need for control was the defining characteristic of both his crime spree and his time on death row. He used the camera to control the moment of his crimes.
And he used the pen to control the perception of his guilt. That need for control explains his absolute refusal to accept any responsibility. To confess would be to admit a loss of control. So even in the highly controlled environment of death row, he used the meager tools available correspondence, attempted publication, to try and reshape his public narrative.
But the relentless nature of time and the inevitable outcome of aging finally brought his legal battle to a halt.
It did. On July 24th, 2021, we get the detail of his final, quiet end.
The California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation confirmed that Rodney James Alcala, the dating game killer, had died. He was 77.
At a hospital near San Quentin State Prison, and the cause was natural causes.
And that detail, natural causes, that is so crucial for understanding the emotional weight of his death for the family. There was no execution, despite the decades on death row. No dramatic final statement, no forced accountability, no final confrontation. Just a medical death, far from the violent ends he delivered to so many.
And that raises this important and really complex question. What does justice actually look like when it arrives so passively, via a hospital bed after 40 years of legal wrangling? The closure achieved this way is inherently messy. It's deeply unsatisfying for those who endured his manipulation and his delay tactics for so long.
So we have to talk about the complex, conflicted storm of emotions felt by the families. For some, the news that he was simply gone provided a finality that the decades of appeals had denied them.
But for others, the lack of an execution felt like a final insult. It robbed them of the justice that they had been promised by the state.
The voice that really captures this dichotomy is Marianne Connolly, Robin Samso's mother. Robin was just 12 years old when Alcala murdered her.
And Connolly's initial reaction was immediate, powerful relief.
Relief that the legal chapter was undeniably closed. Relief that she could finally stop worrying about yet another appeal hearing, another interview, another self-aggrandizing claim from him.
His ability to inflict pain through the legal system was finally over.
But she was very quick to qualify that relief. She stated it so clearly. There's no joy, there's no satisfaction.
And that lack of satisfaction, it stems from the profound injustice of the life disparity. The stark comparison between his lifespan and her daughter's.
She articulated that core injustice that so many families feel. She said, he got to live to be an old man. My daughter was 12. He stole her entire life. He got to keep most of his.
And that is the unavoidable truth of justice delayed. The killer retains the vast majority of his life, while the victim loses everything.
It forces us to confront the reality that for a serial killer who operated with such callous impunity, true justice to find his, balance restored. It's just impossible.
It's impossible. Connolly's conclusion is the one that resonates most deeply. His death simply ends his chapter, but it doesn't equate to full justice. The void he created remains permanent.
And what about the families of the still unidentified victims? For them, the closure is even less defined. Their only form of justice came through the discovery of a photograph, and now there's just this lingering hope that the full truth of their missing loved one might still be found in those boxes.
The end of Alcala's life was the final administrative closure for the state, but the emotional and investigative chapters, they remain wide open. And that forces us to look at the broader, enduring impact he left on American systems and culture.
Okay, so Rodney Alcala is gone. The legal chapter is closed. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, why does his story persist in the public consciousness? Why does it continue to captivate, horrify, and inspire this true crime fascination even now?
Well, his case sits at a very dark, deeply unsettling crossroads of American culture. It embodies the most terrifying narrative we have, the monster hiding in plain sight. He wasn't a lone transient or some figure operating in the dark. He was the charming, handsome stranger. He was the trusted art student with a camera. He was the killer hiding in the spotlight of a national game show.
It's the ultimate breach of societal trust. The podcaster, Chloe, she's featured in our sources, she called it ultimate nightmare fuel.
And she's right. Because we are taught societally to be vigilant, to look for danger in the shadows, or from people who are obviously marginalized. But Alcala proved that danger is often masked by desirability and social ease.
She made that crucial distinction. She said something like, we're taught to be wary of the monster in the alley. We're not taught to fear the charming guy with the camera, the guy society deems a catch.
And Alcala's story just shattered that foundational social script. It demonstrated that the predator can be charismatic, intelligent, highly functional, and literally right in front of us.
And the photos, they amplify that terror. They give us direct access to the predator's mindset. You're looking into the faces of people who were perhaps moments away from their world ending, captured by the killer himself.
It offers an unbearably intimate horror that resonates decades later because we recognize the vulnerability in those ordinary poses. They look like pictures anyone would take.
This cultural fascination, it inevitably translates into media adaptation.
Yeah.
And the focus isn't just on Alcala the man, but on the societal context that allowed him to thrive.
Right. The Netflix producer Alex mentioned that when they were developing shows related to the case, like Woman of the Hour, the focus shifts to the era.
Specifically, the 1970s dating scene.
Exactly. And the pervasive social pressure that women faced. It's about the horrifying dissonance within that context. The film uses the dating game taping as this symbolic pressure cooker.
Focusing on the moment when the bachelorette's intuition screaming against the audience's applause.
That's the core of it. She sensed something was wrong, yet the show and society were all validating him as a desirable, fun partner. That conflict between your personal instinct and public validation, that is the heart of the psychological horror. And that's why the story remains such compelling fodder for adaptation.
But the legacy of Alcala goes way beyond true crime and cultural fascination. It delves into concrete, tangible, and weirdly positive systemic changes that reshaped modern law enforcement.
They did.
Alcala's case became a textbook example of systemic failure. Can you dissect what exactly failed in the 1970s that allowed him to operate so brazenly?
Absolutely. His destructive effectiveness was possible precisely because the system was fragmented. It lacked the necessary communication arteries. We can really categorize the systemic failures into three distinct areas that his case just laid bare.
Okay, let's start with the first and maybe the most critical failure. Cross-jurisdictional communication.
The system lacked any robust mechanism to connect crimes committed across state lines. Alcala was active in California, Washington, New York, Arizona,
All over.
all over. And police departments in 1970s Los Angeles had no easy way of knowing about a similar unsolved murder or a missing person in the Hamptons or Seattle or Phoenix. The lack of a unified national database meant that crimes that were obviously the work of a single serial offender were treated as isolated, local incidents.
So his mobility was his greatest weapon.
Enabled by institutional isolation. And the second failure point relates to his status as a paroled offender.
The failure of parole monitoring.
Yes. Even when he was known to authorities, parole officers were often unable to effectively track his movements across state lines. In the 70s, parole tracking was mostly paper-based and geographically limited.
There was no electronic monitoring, no immediate cross-state notification protocols.
None of that. Alcala could simply drive from California to New York, violate the terms of his parole, and reestablish himself long before the previous state system caught up. It allowed him to easily disappear and reemerge elsewhere to continue offending.
And then there's the most public failure, the one that truly highlighted the breakdown in vetting, his appearance on national television.
That's the third point, the failure of public vetting. He successfully received a clean background check, or at least one clean enough, to appear on a national TV dating show. This demonstrated that even a basic check for a public appearance, which should have flagged his previous convictions for assault and attempted murder, it was fundamentally flawed or incomplete.
It reinforced the idea that the system couldn't even vet the danger hiding right there, in plain sight. It's truly astounding to consider today, where running a basic background check takes seconds on a national scale.
Right. His case just screamed for a connected system.
Undeniably, his impunity became the catalyst. The need for interagency communication and comprehensive tracking became non-negotiable.
And his case, alongside others from that era where killers used interstate movement to evade detection, was a major driver in the development and implementation of the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, VICAP.
Let's detail VICAP for our listeners. What is its structure, and how does it specifically counter the systemic failures that Alcala exploited?
Okay, so VICAP is run by the FBI, and it serves as a national investigative and operational support system. Its core mission is data centralization and pattern recognition. Police departments all across the country input details of unsolved homicide cases, missing persons where foul play is suspected, sexual assaults.
And the system connects the dots.
It uses algorithms to look for commonalities. In method of operation, victimology, geographic patterns, the exact elements Alcala varied across state lines to avoid detection.
So if Alcala were operating today, VICAP would immediately connect a strangled victim found in Seattle with a similar victim found in New York, and it would flag his profile due to his known MO and travel history.
That's exactly right. It forces communication. It ensures that a local, isolated incident is instantly considered as a potential piece of a larger national puzzle. And the Alcala case pushed for tighter laws concerning tracking and monitoring high-risk offenders, fundamentally altering how parole and probation are administered when crossing state boundaries.
So we have this bizarre outcome where a monstrous criminal, through his sheer volume of crimes and his geographical mobility, inadvertently forced positive, lasting improvements in law enforcement infrastructure.
He made it exponentially harder for future predators to mimic his brazen impunity.
That is his unintentional positive legacy.
The reforms he forced the system to adopt. But the greatest lesson may be the psychological one, which was synthesized by Dr. Alina Santos. She argued that Alcala's success was a failure of design in the system, yes, but also a failure of human perception.
We must, she insists, stop being seduced by the mask.
Right.
That brings us back to the core psychological insight we touched on earlier. Charm, she concluded, is not a virtue, but a tool.
It's an implement, used by a predator to disarm and gain access.
This insight is the enduring human lesson. Society needs to understand that outward charisma is merely a presentation, often carefully constructed to achieve a goal. In Alcala's case, proximity to his victims. He was the classic wolf in sheep's clothing.
And his legacy teaches us to look past the surface presentation and trust that quiet internal skepticism, that little voice.
And so we return, full circle, to the most poignant and unresolved elements of his legacy. Those hundreds of photographs that remain unidentified.
Hundreds of faces just frozen in time. These are the lingering ghosts. They belong to people who may be confirmed victims whose bodies were never found. They may be individuals who were never reported missing.
Or maybe people who narrowly escaped an encounter with it.
Exactly, and their families may still be wondering, just caught in this perpetual, agonizing uncertainty.
The search continues because of that archive, and it means that Alcala's psychological scar remains a permanent, low-grade wariness.
It's that subtle hesitation before accepting trust from a charming stranger. The second thought about a too convenient offer. The quiet doubt that lingers behind a seemingly harmless smile.
He fundamentally poisoned a simple human interaction, trust.
He did. His legacy is not just the legal reforms and the cold case breakthroughs. It's the quiet, deep-seated cautionary space he installed in the American psyche regarding trusting appearances.
And most importantly, his legacy is in the enduring grief of families like the Sansos, the Barkums, the Hovers, and the Lamsons families, who received a form of delayed justice, but who can never truly retrieve what he stole from them.
And our role, in reviewing these sources and having this discussion is to actively remember the names of the victims, to make sure they are never overshadowed by the exhaustive, dark infamy of the killer who stole their future.
So we've thoroughly analyzed the three critical facets of Rodney Alcala's enduring legacy. First, his own perverse documentation became this accidental map for justice, unlocking decades of cold cases thanks to digital age investigation.
Right. And second, his operational success exposed these profound systemic failures in the 1970s, leading directly to major reforms like the creation of VCAP.
And finally, his crimes instilled a lasting psychological caution in society. He forced us to question fundamental assumptions about trust and appearance, reminding us that charm can be a very sophisticated tool of predation. Though he is dead, his influence continues to reverberate through forensic science and public consciousness.
This really does.
Though Rodney Alcala is dead, this discussion really concludes with the unsettling idea that the echoes of his evil linger in the cold cases, in the hundreds of photographs awaiting identification, and maybe most powerfully in that quiet cautionary space between trust and fear that he permanently carved into the American experience.
But those echoes form a permanent scar on the American psyche. They remind us that the work of vigilance, of critical thinking, of identification, it continues long after the man who caused the damage is gone. Perhaps the ultimate way to honor the victims is to never stop asking, who is in photo #118 and who is in #119? The justice, however delayed, must continue.